Hello, and welcome back to Chords and Queens, the podcast that dives into the lives and legacies of composers history nearly forgot and shouldn't have. I'm your host, Jennifer Athen, and today we're unraveling an extraordinary story of Louise Farrenc, a 19th century French composer, virtuoso pianist, and music educator whose symphonies are alive with brilliance, yet whose name remains too often missing from the classical canon. So brew a cup of tea, settle in, and let's journey back to the salons of Paris, to a time when women were expected to play the piano at home, but certainly not compose symphonies for public performance. I want to talk to you about some of my favourite pieces, including Le Grand Mère, but before we talk about her work, let's explore the history of this wonderful composer. So, Louise Farrenc was born Jean-Louise Dumont in 1804, right into the vibrant cultural whirlwind of post-revolutionary Paris. I'm talking about, for example, Napoleon has just declared himself emperor, and we were navigating this turmoil and wondering what French society is going to look like from now on. Now, what's quite cool to me is that her family wasn't aristocratic per se, but they were deeply artistic. Some of her female relatives were actually royal painters, and her brother was Prix de Rome winning sculptor Auguste Dumont. Her father, Jacques-Edme Dumont, and her grandfather were both well-known sculptors. I was trying to compare them to a sort of modern famous family in today's world, but could only really come up with the Olsens, and yes, I mean that Mary, Kate, and Ashley, because a lot of their siblings and family were also in show business. So I'm thinking maybe Louise Farrenc is like the Elizabeth Olsen, or perhaps like Debbie Reynolds in Carrie Fisher's family, and she's like the Billy Lord. But anyway, you catch my drift, and perhaps she was an artistic nepo baby, but in a good way, because she obviously was talented and creativity flowed through her veins, and so it wasn't long before Louise gravitated towards music. Now, you know me, I like to really do a deep dive into a composer's history and really find what skeletons they have hanging in their closet. And usually, a lot happens in childhood that can be quite interesting. But unfortunately, detailed accounts of Louise's early childhood are relatively sparse compared to her adult career. We don't know a fair amount about the environment she grew up in and how it influenced her development. We know she studied classics, art, music, and languages. We do know that she learned the piano from the age of 6, tutored by her godmother, who studied with Muzio Clemente, who was an Italian-born pianist who has been hailed as one of the greatest piano virtuosos of our time. So I'm obviously sure that greatness trickled down for sure in some way. So if you feel like I'm jumping ahead into her teenage years or early adult life, it's not for a lack of trying. I just couldn't really source enough childhood content, which is kind of a shame really. All that we do know is that she presented the talent for music super early on and became very skilled at playing the piano before she became a teenager. This is when, at just 15 years old, with the support of her parents, she became a composition student of Antonin Reicha at the Paris Conservatory. And fun fact, he happened to be a friend of Beethoven's, and he also gave lessons to Liszt and Berlioz, so he must have been a pretty good teacher. Now, because she was a woman, she wasn't actually allowed to enroll in the composition classes, but she did take private lessons with Reicha in order to wangle her way around that little rule. In addition to studying composition, she would often play the piano for the community at gatherings, and it's seemingly where she met fellow student and flute pair, great name alert, Aristide Farrenc. Louise and Aristide Farrenc married in 1821. Now, usually when I talk about female composers getting married, it can sometimes be quite a tragic story because their husbands don't want them to make money because it makes him appear weak, or they don't want their wives to go on tour and play in front of, God forbid, other men. Or they have kids and they just need to be taken care of, so their talent for music is just seen as cute, or perhaps could be nice to play a little piano tune before the children go to bed. But I'm happy to report Louise and Aristide had a partnership that, unlike the many marriages of the era, it actually supported her career. In the beginning, they toured Europe together, and I think that's so sweet. They then founded the Editions Farrenc publishing house, which gave Louise greater access to the musical marketplace. I did hear or read somewhere that Aristide was actually burnt out from performing, and that's what inspired him to start a publishing business in the first place, which I thought was very relatable. I mean, not the part where we're all starting publishing houses, but most musicians do feel burnout at one point or another. Her earliest published works were piano solos and chamber music, genres considered more appropriate for women. In 1826, the Farrencs welcomed their first child, Victorine, who began to study music with her mother and actually became a virtuosic pianist herself. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, Farrenc was active as a pianist and began publishing her early piano works through Editions Farrenc. Many of these pieces were theme and variations, like her Air Russe Ferie from 1835. This piece impressed Robert Schumann, of all people, who praised it in his well-known music journal. I don't even want to attempt the name, but I'm going to. The Neue Zeitschrift for Musik. I'm really sorry to all the German people that are listening to this. Highlighting its charming use of counterpoint inspired by Bach. He wrote that listeners couldn't help but be enchanted by it. Now, sadly, Schumann didn't offer the same support to his wife Clara, despite her own talents as a composer and pianist. In his diary, he reflected that composing didn't mix well with having children and a husband who was always improvising. Should have taken some notes from Mr. Farrenc there, Mr. Schumann. But moving on, one of my favourite piano pieces of Louise's is La Grand-Mère, which, if you've taken your French lessons, is translated to The Grandmother. It was written in 1835 and is part of her series of rondeletto pieces for piano, specifically Rondeletto No. 1. And I find this piece truly delightful. So let's listen to an excerpt together. I really think the work showcases Farrenc's flair for melody and graceful ornamentation, rooted in a simple, folk-like tune. It's light-hearted and brisk, embodying the cheerful character implied by its title, The Grandmother. The main theme reappears throughout in playful variations, weaving moments of nostalgia, gentle humour and elegance within a concise framework. Harmonically straightforward and melodically engaging, the piece highlights Farrenc's mastery over melodic development without resorting to virtuosic displays. Instead, she opts for tasteful embellishments and rhythmic vitality, making La Grand-Mère both accessible and expressive. While the tone is light and sprightly, the piece still reflects Farrenc's solid compositional training. Her formal clarity, balancing phrasing, subtle shifts in mood and colour. It is the perfect salon piece, small in scale yet rich in personality, offering performers and audiences a window into the intimate and refined musical world of a leading 19th century composer. I personally love how whimsical it feels, and you have all these sort of clustered chords throughout. The more I listen to it, the darker it feels as well. You've also got these gorgeous runs throughout, which I love because in my head it's just like a young girl at the piano. And instead of playing like a light and pretty song, it deviates into this cluster of sort of like minuscule chaos, which is what I feel like this piece is doing. It's disguised as light and pretty, but it's actually got a bit of space in it. I also couldn't find anything that actually told me what this piece was supposed to be about, so that's my interpretation. Now, she built up a pretty established career for herself as an incredible piano player in the 1930s, and her collection of 30 etudes became a staple for those aspiring to play the piano. All of this, which eventually led to her becoming a professor of piano at the Paris Conservatoire in 1842. And just to put it in perspective, what a big deal this is, she was the first female teacher to become a professor. But don't get it twisted, it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows and equality. She could only teach piano. as unfortunately women still weren't respected enough as composers to teach composition. And from my understanding, she also could only teach women. But still, even a little bit of progress is progress, I guess? Farrenc and her students often played music from the 17th and 18th centuries, carefully following the performance style of the time, something Farrenc had studied in depth as an early student of Renaissance and Baroque music. Her teaching at the Paris Conservatoire was highly successful, with several of her students earning top honours, including her daughter Victorine. Now, again, the job wasn't all rosy, because it turns out she wasn't being paid the same as her male colleagues, doing exactly the same job. Farrenc had a major issue with this, of course you would, and complained to the authorities, which I assume is the university board and higher powers that be, for nearly a decade. And they did nish. Nada. So go with me while I tell you this story because it's important to the wage gap issue here. But in 1849, she wrote a piece for mixed instruments called Nonet that got the attention of German violinist Joseph Joachim, who, just to highlight how important this person is, he actually took Brahms under his wing. Yes, the Brahms. And Joseph loved it and played it, and eventually it became incredibly popular across Europe. So popular that in fact she eventually used the success of this work as leverage in order to finally get paid fairly, and as the same as her male counterparts in 1850. So this piece of work, when I listen to it, for me, is so much more than music. It's a revolutionary piece of history that highlighted that women could compose work at the same level as a man, or greater, and that notion needed to be recognized in educational institutions. So let's listen to the start of this phenomenal, life-altering piece of music. Comprising 4 movements and lasting approximately 30 minutes, the nonet masterfully balances classical structure with romantic expressivity. The opening Adagio Allegro begins with a poised, majestic introduction before transitioning into an allegro that is both lyrical and spirited, with seamless interplay between winds and strings. It stands as a masterpiece of 19th century chamber music and the crowning achievement of her career, scored for a richly textured ensemble of flute, oboe, clarinet, horn, bassoon, violin, viola, cello, and double bass, later optionally arranged as a string quintet by Farrenc herself. The work follows the tradition of major multi-instrumental works by Spohr and Beethoven's septet, sharing its bright key of E-flat and orchestral ambition. So, with the success of this piece and her letter to the director of the conservatory, girl got her bag and was now making the same as her male colleagues, although this success still didn't allow women to teach composition, unfortunately. I mentioned earlier that Louise had a daughter, Victorine, who also became a composer and concert pianist and a huge asset to the Paris Conservatoire. But unfortunately, in 1859, she died after a long illness with TB when she was just 33 years old. Louise was absolutely heartbroken, and she never wrote another piece of music again. Instead, she became an advocate for her daughter's compositions and often edited and performed them. She instead focused her time within her academic work. Most notably, she went on to collaborate with her husband in researching and compiling a 23-volume anthology of keyboard and harpsichord music spanning over 300 years of compositions and work. Alongside the pieces were notes on execution and performance. After her husband Aristide died unexpectedly in 1865, at the age of just 60, Louise poured herself into more work and edited a further 11 volumes by herself, with the final edition published in 1872. On New Year's Day, just 1 year later, she retired from her post as professor of piano at the Conservatoire. Only 3 years later, she died at the age of 69. Louise Farrenc published at least 50 works in total. Most of them were published through the Farrenc Family Publishing Company. Just to break that down for you, she wrote 32 works for solo piano, 2 piano quintets, 4 piano trios, a sextet for winds and piano, a nonet for winds and strings, 2 violin sonatas, a cello sonata, 2 overtures, and 3 symphonies. And so we close this chapter on Louise Farrenc, a composer, pianist, and trailblazing educator whose music speaks with elegance, depth, and power. Like so many other female composers that we talk about on the podcast, Louise Farrenc was a trailblazer and an inspiration to those that want to fight against an unfair system and demanded equality in a time that wasn't ready to quite accept that. Her works, from her early intimate piano pieces to the expansive chamber music like the nonet, reveal a voice both steeped in classical tradition and driven by personal expression. Though her name might not pop up very often in concert programs, Farrenc's music stands the test of time and deserves her legacy as an equal to the likes of Brahms and Beethoven. A great thanks to those who have uploaded the performances as scores on IMS-LP. Everything that I've used here in the podcast will be linked below. And until next time, I'll see you then.